What if the climate models shaping trillion-dollar policy decisions cannot even beat a forecast? So simple a child could make it. Not a supercomputer. Not a vast international panel. Just one blunt assumption. Tomorrow will look a lot like yesterday. That is the question at the heart of a 2025 paper co-authored by Dr. Willie Soon and forecasting researcher Keston Green. And if their conclusion is right, the implications are explosive, because this is not just a disagreement over charts. It is a direct challenge to the predictive credibility of the framework behind modern climate policy. Source. But before you decide whether this is scientific courage or scientific misdirection, there's something you need to understand about Willie Soon, because for decades, he has been one of the most controversial men in climate science. And this new paper is not just another study. It is the latest shot in a war that never really ended. Willie Soon is not a household name, but in climate debate, he has been impossible to ignore. An astrophysicist by training, Soon built his reputation arguing that the sun may play a much larger role in climate change than mainstream attribution studies allow. Again and again, while the world moved toward a tighter carbon-centered narrative, Soon kept asking a different question. What if the models are built on the wrong assumptions from the start? To supporters, that made him fearless. To critics, it made him a contrarian chasing patterns that collapse under scrutiny. Either way, Soon became something rare in modern science. A man whose name triggers a reaction before people even hear the argument. Source. And that matters, because in science, the data may speak, but human beings decide what they're willing to hear. So here is the real challenge for you as a viewer. Can you separate the man from a claim? Can you judge the evidence before you judge the reputation? And if you cannot, what does that say about all of us? This 2025 paper did not come out of nowhere. It grew out a long-running line of argument from Soon and his collaborators that temperature records may be more uncertain than advertised, that urban warming can distort some data sets, and that the sun's contribution may be underestimated when the IPCC chooses specific solar records over others. In a recent Heritage report, Soon and co-authors argued that different choices in temperature and solar datasets can lead to very different conclusions about attribution. Source. That background matters because the 2025 study is not simply asking, is CO2 important? It asks something colder, harder, more dangerous. Do models built around the IPCC's preferred causal framing actually predict out-of-sample temperatures better than a simple benchmark? That sounds technical, but it is a devastating question, because in the real world, a model does not earn trust by sounding sophisticated. It earns trust by surviving contact with the future, and Soon knows that. So instead of fighting the climate battle where it is usually fought, in headlines, slogans, and moral panic, this paper tries to drag the debate into the courtroom of forecasting. Not, does a model fit the past? But, does it predict what comes next? And that shift changes everything. The paper is titled, Are Climate Model Forecasts Useful for Policy Making? Effect of Variable Choice on Reliability and Predictive Validity. It was published in 2025 in Science of Climate Change by Keston C. Green and Willie Soon. The authors tested out-of-sample forecasts using historical subsamples from 1850 onward, comparing IPCC-style anthropogenic models against simpler benchmark forecasts and against alternative models using volcanic and independent solar inputs. They evaluated northern hemisphere land temperatures, including rural-only temperature series, to reduce urban heat concerns. Source. That is the core of the drama. Soon and Green were not satisfied with statistical fit. They wanted predictive validity. So they asked, if you estimate a model on par of the historical record, then force it to predict years it has never seen, how well does it do? And then they did something that sounds almost insulting. They compared those complex causal models to a naive benchmark, a forecast that basically says, future temperatures will sit near the historical median. No grand theory, no heroic assumptions, no machine with 1,000 moving parts, just a baseline. And what happened next is the reason this paper exploded through Soon's audience. The authors concluded that the IPCC-style anthropogenic models they tested lacked predictive validity. On their tests, the independent solar models reduced forecast errors relative to benchmark in all 8 combinations they examined, while the anthropogenic models reduced errors in only 3 of 8 and often produce extreme forecast errors. The paper argues that this unreliability weakens policy relevance and says out-of-sample errors should matter more than in-sample fit when comparing models. Source: read that again. Not slightly weaker, not in need of refinement, not good but imperfect, lack predictive validity. That is why Soon supporters translate the paper into a brutal headline. If the forecast cannot beat a simple benchmark, then what exactly are governments trusting? And suddenly, the issue is no longer abstract climate science. It becomes a question of power, authority, policy, money, control. Because if Soon is right, then one of the most important scientific systems on Earth may be resting on a foundation far less stable than the public has been told. But this is where the story turns. Because the moment Soon fires that shot, the scientific counterattack begins. Scientific explanation and counterargument. Mainstream climate scientists do not accept the idea that climate models have broadly failed. One of the most cited evaluations came from a 2019 paper led by Zeke Housefather, which examined past model projections and concluded that they were generally skillful at predicting subsequent warming. Using one metric, 10 of 17 projections were consistent with observations. Using a forcing-adjusted metric, 14 of 17 were consistent. The paper found no evidence that past models systematically overestimated or underestimated warming. Source: that is a direct collision. Soon's paper says the tested anthropogenic models fail predictive validity. Housefather's review says many historical climate models performed reasonably well. Both cannot be telling the same story in the same way. So what explains the gap? Part of the answer is that they are not testing the problem in exactly the same way. Soon and Green focus on out-of-sample forecast performance using specific temperature choices, including rural-only series, and compare anthropogenic formulations against naive benchmarks and solar alternatives. Housefather and colleagues evaluate published climate projections against what actually happened, while also adjusting for differences between projected and real-world forcings. In other words, this is not just a fight over numbers. It is a fight over what counts as a fair test. Source. And then there is another layer. Carbon Brief, reviewing historical model performance, reached a similar conclusion to Housefather. Climate models published since the 1970s have generally been quite skillful, especially when differences in actual emissions, volcanic activity, solar output, and temperature measurement methods are taken into account. It also notes that some hot models run warmer than observations, but argues that model spread, forcing differences, and short-term natural variability explain much of that divergence. Source: so now the audience is trapped between two narratives. Narrative 1. Soon has exposed a fatal forecasting weakness that policymakers do not want to admit. Narrative 2. Soon has designed a narrow test that produces a dramatic headline while ignoring the broader evidence that climate models have, in fact, perform substantially better than critics claim. Which one do you believe? And more importantly, how would you know if your answer was based on evidence, not instinct? This is where Willie Soon becomes impossible to separate from Willie Soon's history, because the reaction to his work has never been only about equations. It has also been about trust. In 2015, major reporting by the New York Times and others said Soon had received more than $1 million from fossil fuel-linked interests over time and had failed in some cases to disclose funding tied to research papers. Real Climate, while focusing on the science, also pointed to the funding controversy and argued that ethical questions deepened scrutiny of his work. For critics, that history did not merely raise eyebrows. It damaged credibility. Source. Soon's defenders see that episode differently. They argue he was targeted because he challenged an entrenched orthodoxy. They see a scientist punished not for fraud, but for dissent. And whether you agree or not, that perception matters. Because once a scientist becomes a symbol, every paper does double duty. It has to argue the science, and it has to survive the biography. That is the shadow hanging over this 2025 study. Not just, are the results correct? But, would the world even accept them if they were? Soon's critics have been especially harsh on his solar-centered arguments. Real Climate argued that even if one finds correlations between solar records and some temperature series, that does not invalidate the physics of CO2 forcing. The site also said some of Soon's earlier solar correlations weakened or collapsed when updated solar reconstructions and newer temperature data were used. In that view, Soon's logic makes a category error. Showing one factor matters does not prove another factor does not. Source: that criticism cuts straight to the heart of the 2025 paper, because Soon is not just saying, look, the sun matters. Many scientists would agree the sun matters. He is pushing something more disruptive, that the mainstream weighting of causes may be so wrong that policy-relevant forecasts built on it cannot be trusted. That is why the reaction is so intense. If Soon is wrong, then his work risks confusing the public about a real hazard. But if Soon is even partly right, then the scientific establishment may have been defending confidence beyond what the forecasts actually earned. That is not a small disagreement. That is a legitimacy crisis. And yet, even the paper itself is more careful than the headlines built around it. Green and Soon acknowledge limitations. They tested only one extrapolation benchmark. Only 2 independent solar models out of a much larger set, did not test combinations of forecasts, did not consider alternative volcanic estimates, and focused only on Northern Hemisphere data. They also note that even models validated in their study might fail in practice because future causal variables themselves are uncertain. Source: that matters, because if you want to be intellectually honest, you cannot take the strongest possible headline and ignore the caution inside the paper. So here is the uncomfortable truth. This is not a clean Hollywood ending where one study destroys an entire field. It is messier than that, much messier. Soon has not ended the climate debate. He has sharpened one of its most dangerous questions. What should count as proof that a model deserves power over policy? And that question is not going away. So let me ask you directly. If a model explains the past beautifully but struggles against a naive benchmark, do you still trust it? If a scientist has been publicly attacked for years, do you dismiss the new paper automatically? Or do you read it even more carefully because the stakes are higher? And if two sides can look at the same climate system and walk away with opposite conclusions about predictive skill, what does that tell you about the state of modern science communication? Think about that. Because most people do not read the papers. They inherit conclusions. But conclusions are easy. Judgment is hard. And this story demands judgment. In the end, the 2025 Willie Soon paper is not powerful because it settles the climate question. It is powerful because it reopens the most uncomfortable part of it. Not whether climate changes. Not whether humans matter. But whether the forecasting frameworks used to justify policy are being tested hard enough, honestly enough, and against the right benchmarks. Soon says no. Much of the mainstream scientific literature says the opposite. It says climate models, especially when evaluated fairly against real forcings and real observations, have shown meaningful skill. That is a clash. And that is why this story matters. Because beneath the statistics, beneath the politics, beneath the reputations and the accusations, there is one haunting question sitting in the dark. When experts tell us they can see the future, what level of proof do we have the right to demand? If you think Willie Soon is asking the question too many people are afraid to ask, say so in the comments. If you think this paper overreaches, I want to hear that too. But do not give me slogans. Give me your argument. And if you want more deep breakdowns focused only on Dr. Willie Soon, his research, his claims, and the scientific reaction to his work, subscribe now and turn on notifications. Because this story is bigger than one paper. It is about whether science earns trust through consensus alone or through predictions that survive the future.